The American judiciary system is built on a foundational principle, that it is better for 10 guilty persons to escape than for one innocent to suffer. This ideal, immortalized by William Blackstone and woven into the fabric of American jurisprudence, is a promise of fairness, a bulwark against tyranny. Yet, promises can be broken. The story of Stephen Avery from Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, is a harrowing testament to how that bulwark can crumble, not through a single catastrophic error, but through a slow, insidious corrosion of bias, tunnel vision, and institutional self-preservation. His is a story of two crimes, one he did not commit, and one that ensnared him in a legal maelstrom, exposing the terrifying power of the system when it turns against an individual. In the summer of 1985, the shores of Lake Michigan in Manitowoc County were rocked by a brutal assault. A woman, a respected member of the community, was attacked on a beach, dragged into her car, and sexually assaulted. The trauma was severe, and the community demanded justice. The victim identified her attacker as Stephen Avery, a local man from the Avery family, a clan often viewed with suspicion and disdain by law enforcement and townsfolk alike. The Averys ran a salvage yard, were considered rough around the edges, and had numerous minor run-ins with the law. The case against Avery seemed compelling. The victim picked him out of a photo array and later a physical lineup. Her testimony was powerful and convincing. In 1985, forensic science was in its relative infancy compared to today. DNA testing was not yet a practical tool for criminal investigations. The trial boiled down to a classic, he said, she said, but with the immense weight of a victim's positive identification. Avery maintained his innocence from the beginning. He had an alibi that several family members claimed he was with them at the time of the assault. But his word, and the word of his family, was no match for the certainty of the victim and the authority of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. In a trial that now appears shockingly swift, Stephen Avery was convicted of attempted first-degree murder, sexual assault, and false imprisonment. The judge sentenced him to 32 years in prison. The system had worked, or so it seemed. A dangerous predator was off the streets. For the next 18 years, Avery languished in prison. He filed appeals, as all inmates do, but they were routinely denied. The system, once it has reached a verdict, is designed for finality. The gears of justice are not easily reversed. Avery became a forgotten man, a case file in a storage room, a statistic in the Wisconsin penal system. The turning point began not in a courtroom, but in a law school classroom. The Innocence Project, co-founded by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, was gaining traction in the early 2000s. Using newly advanced DNA technology, they were re-examining old cases where factual guilt was in serious doubt. The Avery case came to their attention precisely because of the stark contrast between his insistence on innocence and the seemingly solid eyewitness testimony. Avery's new lawyers, supported by the Wisconsin Innocence Project based at the University of Wisconsin Law School, filed a motion for post-conviction DNA testing. They argued that biological evidence from the 1985 assault pubic hairs found on the victim should be tested against the state's DNA database. The request was a long shot. The evidence was old, and the courts were often reluctant to reopen closed cases. But in 2003, the results came back, and they were seismic. The DNA did not belong to Stephen Avery. It matched another man, Gregory Allen, a violent serial offender who was already serving a 60-year sentence for a similar assault committed in 1995. The truth was staggering. Not only was Avery innocent, but the real perpetrator had been at large, assaulting other women, for a decade after Avery was wrongfully imprisoned. The revelation triggered an investigation that uncovered a deeply disturbing truth. It wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was a case of willful ignorance, at best, and malicious prosecution, at worst. Documents surfaced showing that a Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputy had received a call from a detective in a neighboring county as early as 1995, explicitly stating that Gregory Allen was a prime suspect in a similar assault and should be considered for the 1985 crime for which Avery was convicted. This information was never disclosed to Avery's defense attorneys. The sheriff's department had locked onto Avery and, despite evidence pointing elsewhere, had refused to let go. The blue wall of silence, the unofficial code of loyalty that can prevent police from reporting misconduct by colleagues, had effectively kept an innocent man in prison for 18 years. The judiciary, reliant on the evidence presented by law enforcement, had failed to see through the deception or the blindness of the investigators. On September 11, 2003, Stephen Avery walked out of prison a free man. He was 41 years old. He had entered prison as a young man in his early 20s and had lost nearly 2 decades of his life. The state of Wisconsin, facing undeniable proof of a catastrophic failure, moved quickly to officially exonerate him. Avery, now a symbol of a broken system, did what any exonerated person has the right to do. He sued. His civil lawsuit against Manitowoc County, its former sheriff, and the district attorney sought $36 million in damages for the wrongful conviction and imprisonment. The case was a ticking time bomb for the county, threatening financial ruin and exposing the corrupt practices of its law enforcement agency to the world. The depositions were underway, and the county officials were facing under-oath questioning about their conduct in 1985. The tension in Manitowoc County was palpable. Then, on Halloween of 2005, tragedy struck again. A young freelance photographer named Teresa Halbach visited the Avery family's auto salvage yard to take pictures of a vehicle for a magazine. She was last seen alive at the Avery property. When she failed to return home or answer her phone, her family reported her missing. The investigation immediately focused on Stephen Avery. For the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, the timing could not have been more convenient or more suspicious. Here was the man suing them for $36 million, now at the center of a high-profile missing persons case that quickly became a murder investigation. The national media descended on Manitowoc County. The narrative was irresistible. The wrongly convicted man, freed by DNA, now accused of a horrific, senseless murder. The public's perception was split. Some saw a victim of the system who was being framed to discredit his lawsuit. Others saw a dangerous criminal who had revealed his true nature. The investigation was led by the Calumet County Sheriff's Department, a neighboring agency, to avoid the obvious conflict of interest. However, Manitowoc County officers were allowed to participate in the search of the Avery property, a decision that would become the central point of contention in the case. It was during this search that the key evidence was found. Teresa Halbach's Toyota RAV4 was discovered on the periphery of the Avery salvage yard. A few days later, the most damning evidence emerged. A charred fragment of bone, identified as human, was found in a burn pit behind Stephen Avery's trailer. Then, the most sensational piece of all, Teresa Halbach's car key was found on the floor of Avery's bedroom after the room had been searched multiple times. It was discovered by a Manitowoc County Lieutenant, James Lenk, who had been deposed in Avery's civil suit and was a key figure in the allegations of misconduct from the 1985 case. To many observers, the discovery of the key reeked of a plant. How could a key, belonging to a vehicle found on the property, be missed in several thorough searches, only to appear in plain sight when a Manitowoc officer with a clear conflict of interest was present? The prosecution's case, however, was building. Avery's sweet DNA was found on the hood latch of Halbach's car. A bullet fragment, found months later in Avery's garage, allegedly contained Halbach's DNA. The state's theory was that Avery had lured Halbach to the property, shot her in his garage, burned her body in the burn pit, and disposed of the vehicle on his lot. The trial of Stephen Avery for the murder of Teresa Halbach began in 2007. It was a media circus, foreshadowing the true crime obsession that would explode a decade later. Presiding over the case was Judge Patrick Willis. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Ken Kratz, a confident and media-savvy attorney. Avery's defense team, Dean Strang and Jerome Buting, faced a Herculean task. Their defense strategy was not to prove who else might have killed Teresa Halbach, but to create reasonable doubt about the integrity of the investigation itself. They focused relentlessly on the conflict of interest. They argued that Manitowoc County officers, motivated by a desire to avoid a devastating lawsuit, had planted evidence to ensure Avery was convicted. They highlighted the suspicious discovery of the key. They questioned why the burn pit was not treated as a proper crime scene, with the bones being collected not by forensic anthropologists but with a shovel and a screen. They challenged the DNA evidence on the bullet, suggesting contamination. The trial was a masterclass in the complexities of the American judicial system. It pitted hard forensic evidence, the DNA on the key, the bullet, the bones against the powerful, shadowy suggestion of corruption. The jury was tasked with an impossible decision: believe the science, which pointed to Avery, or believe the narrative of a frame-up, which pointed to a conspiracy within law enforcement. In the end, the forensic evidence and the sheer brutality of the crime overwhelmed the defense's allegations of planting. The prosecution successfully painted Avery as a violent and predatory man, using his past, including an incident where he ran a cousin off the road and threatened her with a gun, to depict him as capable of murder, despite the 1985 exoneration. The judge ruled that details of his wrongful conviction were largely inadmissible, fearing it would prejudice the jury. After a lengthy deliberation, the jury found Stephen Avery guilty of the intentional homicide of Teresa Halbach. Judge Willis sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story did not end with the verdict. Avery's case gained a second life in 2015 with the release of the Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer. The series, viewed by millions worldwide, presented a compelling and heavily slanted narrative in favor of Avery's innocence, focusing on the defense's arguments of evidence planting and investigative bias. It turned Stephen Avery and his nephew, Brendan Dassey, who had also been convicted in the murder based on a highly controversial confession, into household names and international symbols of a corrupt American justice system. The series sparked outrage, petitions for pardons, and intense scrutiny of the Wisconsin judiciary. In its wake, new attorneys, including Kathleen Zellner, a high-profile wrongful conviction lawyer, took up Avery's case. Zellner has filed extensive appeals, conducting new experiments and presenting new theories, arguing that the real killer is still at large and that the evidence against Avery was fabricated. The appeals process continues to this day, a slow, grinding journey through the same system that convicted him. The judiciary's role in this ongoing saga is one of gatekeeping. Appellate courts are not tasked with determining guilt or innocence anew. They rule on procedural errors, constitutional violations, and whether new evidence is significant enough to warrant a new trial. So far, the courts have denied Avery's appeals, upholding the jury's verdict. The story of Stephen Avery is not a simple parable of good and evil. It is a murky, complex, and deeply troubling tale that lives in the shadows of the American judiciary. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Did the system correct itself in 2003 by exonerating him, only to fail him again in 2007? Or did it simply reveal its inherent flaws, the vulnerability to confirmation bias, the immense difficulty of undoing a wrongful conviction, and the terrifying power of the state when its institutions feel threatened? The true crime of the Stephen Avery saga may be that we may never know with absolute certainty what happened to Teresa Halbach. The jury reached its verdict, and the appellate courts have, thus far, affirmed it. But the reasonable doubt sown by the defense, and amplified by global media, persists. The system demands finality, but justice demands truth. Stephen Avery's life, bookended by two devastating encounters with the law, serves as a permanent cautionary tale. It reminds us that the blindfold on Lady Justice must represent not only impartiality but also a constant vigilance against the human failures, the biases, the grudges, the institutional self-interest that can blind the system it is meant to protect. The promise that 10 guilty people should go free to save one innocent is a noble one, but the case of Stephen Avery stands as a stark. The blindfold of justice is meant to ensure impartiality, but sometimes, it simply allows the system to look away from its own mistakes.